Hi.
Hi there, how are you doing? Right, well, look, if everybody's here and we're all ready to go, I have to leave fairly sharpish at 2 o'clock because I've got to be somewhere else at 5 past, which of course in the bad old days would have meant running from one end of Brighton to the other or something like that. But these days it's so good afternoon to everyone. Thank you all for joining us for this lunchtime discussion around the title of whether it is time to disestablish the Church of England. We have 3 speakers with us today. Baroness Burt, Liberal Democrat spokesperson in the House of Lords for Equalities, former MP for Solihull and general good person all round. Laurelie probably needs very little introduction to a Lib Dem audience. We also have other all-round good people. We have Simon Barrow joining us from Leith in Edinburgh, or Leith next to Edinburgh, I think I probably should say.
Absolutely.
Simon is the director of Ekklesia, Beliefs and Ethics think tank. He's a writer and commentator and was previously Assistant General Secretary in Britain and Ireland. Third speaker, is Cordelia Tucker O'Sullivan. She was lead author of Time for Reflection, the Humanist APPG, that's the all-party parliamentary group in Parliament, the 2020 report into religion and belief in the UK Parliament. She led Humanist UK's lobbying at the United Nations between 2015 and 2017, following which she led a research project investigating the relationship between religion and the UK state. That in turn led to the publication of a report on the influence of religion in Parliament. Since then, she has led the women's sector response to Brexit as part of a small feminist campaigning organisation and now leads the policy and public affairs team at the country's largest specialist provider of services for survivors of violence against women and girls. To visitors to come, you are all very welcome. I will in a second ask Laurelie to give us the first contribution. We will have time, I hope, for questions and answers. If you can, first of all, make sure that the space to the right of your screen as you look at it is clicked onto Fringe and Training instead of Event. So you should be underlined in Fringe and Training. And if you could put any questions that you want into Q&A rather than into chat, because we'd anticipate that the chat will get quite busy and the chat will be not just for questions. So if you want us to find your question and to get to it, then please put it in Q&A and Toby Keynes will pick it up there. So I think there is no further housekeeping that is necessary. So can I ask Laurelie Burt first, please, to offer us a few thoughts on this? Laurelie.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. In this particular organisation, I think the disestablishment of the church is a little bit controversial. I'd like to go from the position of someone who's in the Lords. As Alistair said, I've been in both houses, and we have in the House of a very lovely woman called Rose. What's that? Is she still there, Alistair? Is Rose still there? You've muted yourself, dear.
I've unmuted myself now. Rose Hudson, with another name I can't remember, has actually moved on. She, I think, is now a bishop, but I might be wrong.
Yeah. Is she? Yeah. Well, I mean, a lovely, lovely woman with a very inspiring voice and hardworking. But it does beg the question, I thought, when I was an MP, why? Why are we starting our proceedings with prayers, and why is it always the Church of England? And then I got to the Lords and discovered that not only do we start off the proceedings with prayers, the prayers are arguably the most boring prayers that you could find in the Bible. And having asked why that might be, apparently it's because it was laid down zillions of years ago when Parliament first started, so they have to follow this particular text, no matter how many times it's been done before and how boring it is. And also you get a lot longer of praying and all the rest of it in their lordship's house. But not only that, we've also got 26 Anglican bishops, and when they operate fully in the House of Lords, if they stand up to speak, which is in the olden pre-COVID days, then everybody else has to sit down. So they're first in the pecking order, and they have a special name to which to be referred to, which is the Right Reverend Prelate. As I said, prayers are not exactly thought for the day, but I don't think that's the most important thing. I think you might be interested to know what kind of things their Right Reverend Prelates do in the House of Lords, and obviously there's a big question as to why they should be there in the first place. And Dick Taverne, one of our most reverend and senior peers, put in a private members bill to abolish the positions of these individuals, no matter how good they are at the things that they do. His bill has now fallen, as all bills do, private members' bills do, at the end of a session. But the kind of things that they get involved in, they don't directly criticise any particular party. They're an unpolitical group, and in fact on Monday I'm coming in on a question by the Bishop of Gloucester, who's a lady called Rachel Trewick, and she specialises in the situation of prisoners. And that really is typical of the kind of thing that they do. So I'll be coming in on the effect of COVID on prisoners. And I think that's a very worthwhile question, but it does still beg the question of why it should be a bishop. I'm quite capable of asking questions on COVID and prisoners. And no, I don't go down to her cathedral or wherever she hangs out and tell her how that she should be running things, and I don't really see that it's an important thing for her to be coming in on our affairs. But they do basically social issues, they do international issues, health. They've had a large part to play in domestic violence as well. But they don't criticise the government, and the cynically minded amongst us might think that could have something to do with the fact that they know where their bread is buttered. It's like, I don't know. I don't know whether I should be making such allusions, but certainly they will not get involved in politics. So just looking a little bit more widely, I've done a fair bit in my time on equalities, and I suppose my main concern about the establishment of the Church of England is that nobody, in my view, should be disadvantaged. And in fact, it's in the Equalities Bill Act, that no one should be disadvantaged by virtue of belonging to a faith. But you could say that if no one's disadvantaged, then certainly the Church of England are advantaged because of their entrenched position, and I'm sure Cordelia will have more to say about that. So really, you know, my grandchildren go to a faith school because it's a very good school, but her parents are of no faith. But it does make you worry a little bit about what kind of proselytizing is actually being carried out at faith schools. I remember when I was an MP going to a Catholic school, and I was walking with a head teacher across the playground, and this little boy with a bright, shining face came running up to him saying, "Sir, sir, he is risen, he is risen." You know, and this child was really excited about that, and so it makes me uncomfortable, I've got to say. Northern Ireland, of course, we see what segregation by religion has done in schools as well, and we have promoted mixed religion schools, but they're pretty thin on the ground still, which I think is a shame, because schools can be a major way of influencing and supporting for good, but it can also be used, of course, in the different ways of when they are segregated. So yeah, just thinking about the world. You know, we've got so many different countries where religion plays the part of the state. And in conclusion, I just say, you know, it's the mixing of the church or of religion, whatever religion it is, and state, which causes problems and issues. That's why I'm here today. I'm a member of the Humanists, and you know, I do honestly believe that whatever state structures we have, they should be inclusive of everybody, and that's what I'd like to see what I can do in the future to make happen.
Thank you very much indeed. Look, when it comes to the Q&A, I will kind of try and keep the discussion fairly tight. Disestablishment, and then faith schools are kind of separate issues. So I will allow the speakers a bit more latitude than I'm going to be allowing the questioners at a later stage. But listen, thank you for that. And now we move on to Simon Barrow. So Simon, coming from an ecclesiastical position, it's the position of one particular church that we are considering, and the position they have in our government structures today. Simon, the floor is yours.
Indeed, thank you very much. Yeah, I should confess at the outset that I have some form on this. I've been engaged in these issues for about 20 years. Somewhere in your bargain bin, you might find a copy of Setting the Church of England Free, The Case for Disestablishment, which was published in 2001. It's terribly bad form, so I can't remember who the Liberal Democrat at the launch of it was, but I remember that Tony Benn was there, so it was a sort of cross-party question. So at the outset, picking up on your comment, Alistair, I think it's actually really important to be clear what establishment is and what it isn't. The term has a very specific reference. What it means is that the Church of England is subject to the Crown and given a certain position in relation to the state by the Crown in law. Other privileges, such as retaining bishops in the House of Lords, such as the expansion of church schools which are allowed to discriminate on the basis of religion or belief in selection and employment, and that's something Ekklesia has worked on with the Humanists and with other groups to seek reform of that, such as church leaders claiming to speak on behalf of the nation, may be argued to flow from establishment, but they are not establishment itself. The mechanism of establishment by which just one church from just one nation claims an official place in the parliamentary and legal framework of the UK is, you could say it's a technical matter, but I think perhaps the best way of thinking about it is that it's a key that opens the door to other advantages and gives the Church of England a privileged place overall. And the clear case against establishment from my point of view, can be made on both secular and theological grounds. I would argue on both those sorts of grounds. Not everyone would, of course. First, the existence of a state church, and especially a state church from just one part of the UK, is, even in an attenuated form, deeply anomalous, it seems to me, with a modern plural democracy, which in a whole different set of respects is perhaps best described as a mixed belief society, and which aspires to equality for all people, whatever their belief or non-belief. And I think that anomaly is particularly sharp in a case where the practicing church membership of the Church of England amounts to around 1 million people at most in a country with a population of 56 million. Second, it leads to a situation where, as we've heard, leaders of one church in one nation sit in an unelected chamber and help shape the laws governing people whose own multi-faith and secular nations owe no allegiance to the Church of England. And sometimes, indeed, they have used those positions to push back against equality legislation with which they disagree, to the detriment of many others, including, I would point out, LGBTQIA+ Christians. So I'm very happy when I hear bishops get up and speak on housing and poverty and other kinds of issues, but they're also there to defend their own privilege. The Anglican churches in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, it should be noted, are disestablished. Indeed, the only established church in the entire worldwide Anglican Communion, which claims around 85 million adherents, is in England. And this makes it an anomaly even within its own global family, as well as an obvious relic and hangover of a colonial era. Third, and speaking from a dissenting Christian viewpoint, the kind of earthly power, privilege and wealth embodied in established status seems to me to stand in direct contradiction to the life and being of Jesus, who proclaimed and acted good news to the poor, whose mother sang about the mighty being tumbled from their thrones, whose death was engineered by a fatal alliance of the interests of state and religion at his time, and whose earliest followers were seen as directly subversive of empire, militarism, domination, and the ethics of Caesar. In other words, from where I stand, the whole culture and status of establishment is inimical to the levelling dynamic of the gospel based on the power of love overturning the love of power. It is, you could say, the fading part of a top-down Christendom order which has prevailed for 1700 years, and that's one in which churches have sought protection, privilege and temporal power in exchange for blessing the powers that be and for sacralizing earthly orders which are often unequal and monarchical. So how can disestablishment be achieved? The mechanism required is actually quite straightforward. Ian MacLean, who's Professor of Politics at the University of Oxford, set out a simple bill to effect it some years ago in his book, What's Wrong with the British Constitution? The real problem, I should mention in passing, and it is a big problem, is not disestablishment per se, whatever the ecclesiastical victors defending it try to tell you. It's untangling a complex web of property and investment rights tied to the crown and to the current status of the church. That is a big issue, but establishment itself could be achieved fairly straightforwardly. But likewise, it's not an own issue, a sort of lone issue. It's part of a wider architecture involving, as we've heard, the monarchy, the Lords, an unwritten constitution, and other features which I would describe as archaic within the UK landscape. And while I'm going to be a bit controversial here, forgive me, while your party and the two large parties at Westminster are rushing around desperately trying to defend the Union in its current form against rebels like me from Scotland, I made Scotland my home 11 years ago, it seems to me that there's pretty little chance that there'll be any appetite for disestablishment, which on close examination turns out to be part of a stack of cards that's looking increasingly fragile. Equally, I hate to say this, but my own view is that there's vanishingly little chance of a genuinely reforming government at Westminster taking power in the near future that would want to put it on its agenda. And meanwhile, the liberal instincts of your own party, which I greatly respect and which have trodden closer to disestablishment in England than most, are likely to be overcome, as they have been in the past, by your desire to preserve many other aspects of the current UK status quo, notwithstanding electoral reform, which of course I very heartily agree with you on moral and political grounds. And so finally, where this leaves us, I think, is in a position whereby the cultural and social disestablishment of the Church of England, the sort of informal disestablishment, will go on happening. It'll continue within the nation, of which it is an increasingly small part, while the mechanisms that give it the kind of status it has are maintained, but increasingly shaky. Now, last comment I want to make is that from my point of view, it would be something like a vision of a Commonwealth of the British Isles, something that could confederally link perhaps independent nations and more autonomous regions, which could actually afford the opportunity not just to unravel establishment and other unreformed aspects of our current polity, but to replace them with something better, more imaginative, more connected, and more thoroughgoingly civic. But I realise that's a much larger conversation, and I hope you'll forgive me for framing it in that way.
Find that we're a forgiving lot, Simon. Not least, just say parenthetically that, you know, I've been in this party for 40 years, and for the first, people told me that we would never see reform of the United Kingdom, that Scotland would never get a devolved parliament.
Yep,
and
exactly.
20 years ago, we got it. We were told that we would never get any proportional representation. We've not got it for Westminster yet, but we've got proportional parliaments and assemblies and in Scotland councils all over the place. So change never comes at a rush in this country.
Lots of things are possible. Just before I hand over, just before I hand over, one thing I ought to say is that I enjoyed working with Liberal Democrats and others back in 2010. There was a campaign called Power 2010, which revolved around political reform, you'll probably remember. And as part of that, Ekklesia encouraged people to write polite, constructive letters to bishops in the House of Lords, encouraging them to think about their rather anomalous position and maybe to consider the possibility of reform. What we argued was not a problem with the bishops in a second chamber. The question is they should get there the same way as everyone else and not represent just one interest. And I have to say, I had a very rude letter from the headquarters of the Church of England telling us that it was bullying that thousands of people wrote to members of an elected chamber to inquire about their engagement in reform of those institutions. And I think that tells you something about the mentality, but I think that kind of constructive engagement is what we need.
Okay, I've been asked if I can increase my volume. I've got no idea, but if I maybe sit closer to the microphone, that may help things. Right, the third speaker then, before we come to the question and answer session, is Cordelia Tucker O'Sullivan. So Cordelia, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you so much, Alistair, and thanks Laurelie and Simon for your contributions. And yeah, my lengthy introduction at the beginning was to try and I think alleviate some confusion, because I've worn quite a lot of different hats in my time, and I have very recently worked with Laurelie on the domestic abuse bill in my capacity as working for Refuge. And actually, Alistair, you came to one of our press events earlier last year, so just to try and help people place me, I've done. So yes, a couple of years ago, I researched and wrote the report that you touched on, that looked at the role of religion or belief in the UK Parliament. And I wanted to focus on a couple of key elements in the report, but also what I've learned about the softer power of the bishops in the House of Lords, beyond kind of formal legislating power. I think for both houses, some of the procedures and the kind of processes can be, I think, opaque is probably a fair way to put it. It's not very straightforward from the outside perspective. I've learned a lot in the past few years around doing some extensive bill lobbying, particularly around the role that bishops play in that process. So as both Laurelie and Simon touched on, there are 26 bishops that sit in the House of Lords as of right, but it's also convention for former archbishops of Canterbury and York to also be awarded a life peerage once they retire from that role. And these bishops participate as active legislators. They speak in debates, they serve on parliamentary committees, and of course they vote. And the way that they're treated in the House of Lords is essentially as their own separate party, except they represent the interests of the church. the main way, and I think that when it comes to votes, between, and when I conducted the research between 2002 and 2018, we know that they've changed the outcome of a vote on 9 occasions. So it's, while that's, you know, in my view, and I'm sure many people participating in their view, is nine occasions too many. In reality, it's a fairly small number of occasions where they've changed a particular vote, which has not necessarily led to a change in the law. But this just captures one element of the way that bishops use their influence over legislative outcomes, which is much more frequent and in some ways much more effective in terms of the outcomes that they actually have of the laws across the UK. So as I said, bishops are treated as a distinct grouping within the House of Lords. These are usually done along party affiliation. So you have a group of Labour peers, Conservative peers, Liberal Democrat peers, crossbenchers who are appointed to the Lords as essentially independent experts in a particular field. So you'll have former presidents of the Supreme Court, former director of the public prosecutions, lots of legally minded people in particular, but also others that get appointed and not through their party affiliation, as well as bishops constituting their own separate group. And what this means in practice is that as bills are going through Parliament, all of these groups are entitled to separate audiences with ministers and officials that are working on that bill on the same basis as political parties. And when I say entitled, this is through convention rather than it being a, you know, written down in kind of a, you know, procedures of the House. But the reality is that bishops as a group get that very direct and influential audience with ministers, where they can then influence the content of a piece of legislation before it ever even gets to a vote. In addition to this, in the House of Lords, when an amendment is tabled to a piece of legislation, you can have a maximum of 4 signatories on an amendment. And the makeup of those signatories is very often used as a signal to the government about the cross-party support for that amendment, and therefore is used as a tool to pressure the government to concede on a particular issue. And through my work in the House of Lords over the past few years, generally speaking, it is agreed that the best makeup of signatories is a Conservative, or, you know, the party of the government of the day, a Liberal Democrat or Labour peer, and then a crossbencher or a bishop, seen as the kind of the independent groupings within the House of Lords, and then plus one other peer. And essentially this does mean that the views of bishops carry a lot of weight with the government of the day, and the amendments that have their names appear on them are more likely to be accepted by the government, and the bishop swaying the decision and the outcome of our legislation in this way, and through these kind of unofficial meetings with ministers, is a much more common way for bishops, in addition to other peers, to sway the views of the government rather than directly swaying a vote. And I think that, again, the way that this interacts with the views and the actions of other peers in the House of Lords is that it's common when you're working with a peer on an amendment for them to try and encourage bishops to sign their amendment, in recognition that if they manage to do that, they're more likely to win, and they're more likely to get a government concession. And not only that, but for charities and, you know, other pressure groups who are also working on amendments, it's also a big part of their work is to try and encourage bishops to agree with them on a particular amendment, because it will increase the chance of it being successful. I wanted to briefly touch on the kind of the reversal of this coin, which is Parliament's role in internal church governance. So in addition to the fact that the sovereign, or the Queen at the moment, is of the faith, which features in things like the coronation oath, swearing loyalty to the church, and, you know, which brings up its own issues when you think about individuals who might become sovereign and what would happen if they were not of the faith. That raises questions about what would happen, and certainly is, I think, would think is highly discriminatory for that particular individual. The Parliament having a role over internal church governance means that when church rules, that can be are very often internal administrative or organisational rules, have to go through the parliamentary process before they can be applied to the church, known as church measures, which is not just a formal role. Parliament has on several occasions rejected church measures, which is troubling for two reasons. Firstly, it elevates the legal position of the church, of one denomination over another, but it also, albeit rarely used, gives the state the power to interfere with the internal workings of the church, which is also, as Simon touched on earlier, not exactly compatible with a pluralistic democracy. So I just, both kind of bringing these sort of two or multiple elements of what both Simon and Laurelie said in terms of, establishment. These two features, I think, should really cause concern for, everyone, including those who belong to the Church of England, because it means that Parliament has a role in what your church does, as well as vice versa. But yeah, thank you very much for inviting me, and that was just a little part of that report that I wanted to cover.
Cordelia, thank you very much. Right, we're just after the half hour, so we've got the guts of half an hour left for questions and answers. Toby, you're going to corral the questions and read them out, and I'll then farm them around our speakers. Is that how we're going to work it?
Sorry, I'm just appearing at the moment. There we go. Right, I guess that's how it works, yes. It is, of course, entirely up to you. I should point out that the session actually runs until 2:15. If you'd like to think about how we should handle that.
Right, I'll maybe hand the chair to you at 2:15, because I'm due to be speaking on vaccine passports at 2:15, and why they are a dangerous redefinition of the relationship between the citizen and the state that the party should have nothing to do with. Just parenthetically, put in the wee plug here in case I don't get called. And I need to be in the waiting room for that at 5:15. So I'll leave you to do the final few minutes of chairing then if I can. But anyway, for the meantime, shall we get going with the questions? What do we have?
Okay, yes, I'd like to start with two questions and one point extracted from a comment. Alex Brewer asks, are there peerages reserved for other religions? And Philip Thompson asks, should we go for gradual change or outright abolition? And Alison Glasspool comments, does disestablishment mean abolishing the Church of England?
Right, okay, look, I'll give you some of the factual stuff. No, there are no other reserved seats, although you do get different heads of churches and faiths who've had seats in the House of Lords. The last chief rabbi was a peer. Next year's moderator of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland will be a peer, but that's just because he's already a peer and not because he's moderator of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland. So no, there is no other reserved sort of corner of our theocracy in this way. I think probably only ourselves and Iran would be the only other country that would have this sort of engagement. But Simon, can I ask you to pick up the other about the interaction there?
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that, Alistair. I mean, interestingly, in about 2003, 2004, I can't remember the exact date, the church leaders meeting of churches together in Britain and Ireland had quite a discussion about this question of bishops in the Lords and only one church being represented, etc. Now, I should add, I was an officer of that at the time, and therefore I wasn't in a position where my views as effectively a civil servant could come into it. And you've heard my views, and they're fairly trenchant. But it was quite interesting that a number of other churches sort of suggested, well, maybe those 26 seats should be shared amongst some of the other churches, including the churches in the other nations. And the Church of England got really quite upset at that suggestion. And then some people suggested, well, what about an interfaith component and so on? Now, as it happens, I think there's an argument against having reserved exclusive religious representation of any kind in an elected chamber, which of course also fits with my view that the second chamber should be radically reformed, I think substantially elected, and if there's going to be appointment on another basis. So it's difficult to disentangle those issues, but it was quite interesting to see that there was an awareness of this and a concern amongst some of the other churches about the nature of that representation. But frankly, it didn't get anywhere, not least because, of course, the ecumenical institutions, which have shrunk incredibly since 2003, 2004, were almost wholly financially dependent upon the Church of England, who provided over a quarter of the funding at that point, and also the Catholic bishops of England and Wales in particular. So there's been a sort of internal struggle about those kind of questions.
Mm-hmm. So Cordelia, are you wanting to England then? Yes.
Not the first time that I've been asked that. I think particularly at the UN, I think there was a group of us from various countries, so colleagues from particularly from America and others, others would make joke about us being these kind of like horrible group of atheists that want to just tear down other churches. It's obviously, well, okay, obviously not obvious, but is not the case at all. I think that what this discussion has, I hope, made very clear is that it's not about, it's about one denomination having privilege, legal privilege, in many, many different ways that have real impacts over other religious denominations and over the non-religious. And this is fundamentally inconsistent with a secular democracy, and it would absolutely not lead to the abolition of the Church of England. It would just put their legal position on the same footing as other. Strictly speaking, there are lots of other ways, actually, not least to do with various marriage laws. There are lots of other, I suppose, religious privileges for different groups. But at least in this way, it would mean that that elevated position in the kind of the formal institutions in the United Kingdom or in England would not be. Would be no more, but it certainly wouldn't lead to the abolition. I mean, all these other religions that are not established churches continue to exist without being established. But yeah, it's unfortunately a common question, but I hope that that it's one that people leave here today and not believe.
Lorley, do you want to come in at this point? Because I'm going to be a little provocative in a minute and act as a devil's advocate. I can see your lips moving, Lorley, but you're on mute. No.
Sorry. No, I was just saying how unusual for you to be a little bit provocative, Alistair. Yeah, I just thought I might pick up the other question, which is should the disestablishment of the church, or particularly getting rid of the bishops in Parliament, be done wholesale or gradually? Certainly, when it's come to reducing the numbers of the House of Lords, we have come up with our own plan of how to do it, very, very gradually, very, very slowly. But even that, unfortunately, has been rejected by the government. So I don't see that the only, I was going to say COVID is a glimmer of light. It really isn't. But I think that there'll be a lot fewer peers returning once we all go back after COVID. And I think there'll be amongst the younger members, and I'm hopeful that that might prompt a slightly more open minded approach to how we do tackle some of these difficult issues. Nobody's pretending that they are not, but when it comes to reform of the House of Lords, I think that the next few years could well prove quite promising in that respect.
to be devil's advocate for a second, and just picking up some of what Cordelia said there about influencing government, influencing power and the rest of it. Let me play devil's advocate, because I want to put a bigger context into this discussion about how government and how legislation in this country works. Lots of people influence government in different ways. You know, big corporate interests spend a fortune influencing government. The third sector spend a fortune influencing Parliament. Isn't there something that would be, you know, what you've got here at least is transparent. You can see it for what it is, what's going on behind closed doors. So there is a transparency to the way that the churches seem to influence things here. Do we really want to be pushing that behind the scenes?
I'm happy to come in here as I've got experience on a few of those things. So I think the first thing, actually on the last point about it kind of being transparent, I actually think having worked within these institutions as an outsider, I'm not sure that people actually really understand just the level of influence that bishops have. I mean, you know, talking about these kind of groupings of parties within the House of Lords, and the rights of audience that gets with ministers, which as a third sector organisation is really hard to get. It's not easy to to do that. I think that there's definitely, I think, particularly with corporate interests, less so I think the third sector, because we do tend to be quite upfront about the sort of, you know, what our campaigning objectives are. So, you know, you can go on to, you know, so I work for Refuge, go onto our website and you can see the list of 5 priorities for the domestic abuse bill, and you can go on our Twitter and you see that. If you look at Facebook, they're not going to be telling you what they're lobbying on for the online safety bill, which is, you know, coming up. So I think that there is an issue with transparency. But I think the main thing with the bishops is that they have this by right position, not just to have conversations, but to actually legislate directly, which is something that no other, you know, group really has, or a group kind of defined in that sort of way. I think it's an interesting question just about generally how pressure groups and corporate interest engage with Parliament, which is, I mean, a really interesting question, not one that I feel I can answer at the moment, except from my position as being, you know, working in various organisations. You know, our interest is in representing, you know, the people who, well, our organisations represent. So for me, survivors of violence against women, which we're always very upfront about. But we can't directly legislate. So that would be my first thought.
I agree.
I say reform all around the place. Lobbying is one aspect. The way that people get into the House of Lords in the first place, you know, it might be that there's a role for a small number of appointed people, as you have in Ireland, for example. I'm open to suggestion in that, but by and large, you have to start surely with a presumption of election. That's the way. If bishops want to get into the House of Lords, then, you know, they can get their signatures on a nomination form like everyone else, I'd say. Right, Toby, next round of questions, if you can.
Yes, party political to some extent. First of all, what are the opinions of representatives of other faiths on the establishment and disestablishment of the Church of England? Sorry, that isn't party political. Secondly, what is the appetite for this issue in Tories, among the Tories, the Labour Party and the SNP? Those questions are from, I beg your pardon, Marisha Ray and Nick Hodder, and from Joy Winder. Has conference ever had a vote on disestablishment? If not, why not? And if you'd like me to provide the historical answers to those, if you don't know them, I can do so. I'm afraid we just seem to have lost Alistair, hopefully briefly. In his absence, would the rest of you like to tackle those, perhaps starting with Cordelia?
it's a difficult. I mean, to touch on the first question, the kind of views of other faiths. You know, I mean, to start with, obviously, individuals in different faiths will have vastly differing opinions, but there are, you know, groups, you know, British Muslims for a Secular Democracy. There are groups that are populated by religious individuals that still very much oppose establishment. Obviously, Simon being one of them who's joined us here. Yeah, in terms of the appetite among Tories, Labour and the SNP, and this my information is probably slightly out of date, to be honest with you, but it's not been, in my view, something that has been priority. If individuals, and even if a large majority of politicians within the party agree with it in principle, it certainly hasn't been something that has been prioritised. I think it's generally seen as something, even if people agree with it, if the population and the electorate agree with it, it's not something that isn't going to sway a vote either way when it comes to a general election, is my view. But that's a very that's a slightly conjecture, but on the conference vote, I couldn't tell you. So
right, Simon.
Okay, I mean, yeah, I agree with everything that Cordelia has just said. I mean, the end of my talk was relatively pessimistic about this coming to the fore, I'm afraid. But I think there are some issues of principle which should nevertheless be articulated. And as Alistair says, surprising things happen in politics that you can't game, and you shouldn't just wash things away because that they're not popular. I mean, the Tories will be very strongly opposed to disestablishment because of the kind of structure of society that they want to see. I think the Labour Party has generally run away from those issues, quite divided on it. I don't know whether I'm going to lose all credibility by admitting that I'm a member of the SNP, so I can comment on that. First of all, I don't think the SNP would probably be allowed to vote if it came to the Commons in that, because it probably would be seen as a reserved issue. I'm not sure about that, but they don't choose to be part of the House of Lords. I'm sure there would be, you know, a feeling that it's not appropriate. But I mean, I really don't think, you know, having said that, I should also say, of course, Ekklesia doesn't belong to any party. We have members of different parties and try to work across those more generally on the centre left. And I think, as Cordelia says, there's an increasing recognition that this architecture does need to change. As far as the position of other faith communities are concerned, there are two difficulties. The first is that, for example, with Muslim communities, and note that I use that as a plural term, out with the Muslim Council of Britain, which is a sort of contested reality in itself, it's difficult because of the structure of Muslim communities to find representative voices on these kinds of issues. That's always been one of the problems. However, I think there probably would be a disposition in many different faith communities towards retaining establishment, if only because there is a fear about religion being pushed out of public life, etc., etc. Now, I personally think, with a lot of engagement, I lived in Southall in West London for many years, so I'm not speaking from a remote thing. I think these fears are misplaced and can be handled in different ways, but I think the Church of England will instantly come in and say, oh, other faith communities support our role. That's what it will do. That's true to an extent, but it avoids a lot of issues to another extent as well.
Right, Alistair, Simon and Cordelia have responded so far.
Yes, my apologies for that. I moved in my seat and realised then that I hadn't moved on the screen and that I had a problem. Just on this point about other parties, look, I think in general, you were only ever going to see change in this as part of a bigger package. Yeah. So I think you know, you're looking at something that does involve direct elections and you know, getting rid of the hereditaries and the bishops would be part of that package. I don't know if you remember, but when Richard Younger Ross was in Parliament, he had the last question ever to Tony Blair at Prime Minister's Questions, and he asked about the disestablishment of the Church of England, and Blair had actually just delivered the carefully crafted sort of payoff line, and thought that he'd finished his last ever PMQ. And then the speaker decided that he was still going to call Richard. So Richard stood up and he asked about the disestablishment of the Church of England. And Blair was as nonplussed as I have ever seen him. And he sort of just looked at the chamber. He had nothing left. And he said, you know what? I just don't have to care about that sort of thing anymore. So I thought that was quite illuminating about the approach of Labour to the subject, at least. Have we cantered around these questions, Toby? Can we fit in another round?
Laurelie has not responded on this one, and
I
also said that if you'd like, I can comment on the historical position regarding conference votes on disestablishment.
Well, let's hear that first then.
Okay, well, the answer is that the last time we voted on disestablishment as a whole was in 1999, which is quite a long time ago, and I don't know whether that even has standing anymore. The motion was Church of England, this conference calls for disestablishment of the Church of England, which I suspect is the shortest motion we've ever debated, and it was passed. Since then, on a number of occasions, conference has confirmed that we would like to abolish the bishops in the House of Lords, at least the bishops' reserved places, but I don't think we've ever touched on any other aspect of disestablishment since 1999.
Simon, you wanted to come in on the Christian nation comments?
Yes, indeed. I was just as you were talking, or as you were referring that to me, Alistair, just searching in the book that I mentioned at the beginning about there was the 1970 Chadwick report. I think Liberal Democrats did lobby for that, so that there is a bit of a history of that. Yeah, I mean, I just want to say on the Christian nation thing is a difficult thing. I mean, I personally, as a Christian, think it's disastrous to start to conflate nations with religions, even in a kind of weak and attenuated form. You know, John Major's church spires and warm beer and cricket and so on. It just seems to me profoundly unhelpful. There are people and communities of faith and belief of different kinds. We should engage and respect those through civic society. They should have a voice. But I think trying to define a nation as Christian, and if you begin to unpack what the notion of England or Britain as a Christian nation is, you start to delve into empire and all kinds of things, which are actually quite difficult, to say the least. I think I'm one of those non-conformist Christians, who happens to be an Anglican, as a matter of fact, who very much believes in a separation of state and religion, which doesn't necessarily mean a separation of religion and politics. I mean, most people who say religion and politics should be separated don't tend to think that Desmond Tutu is something awful, because he's not trying to get a privileged position for the church. He's trying to work with other communities for liberation, for freedom, and so on. It's a very different kind of approach, and its base is civil society, not privilege within parliamentary or other institutions. So I'd encourage us away from this Christian nation thing. And my last comment is, somebody sort of said, oh, well, it's inclusive. Well, who's the we in this is one question. And secondly, when the number of practicing members of a community are a small part of a population, turning around and telling everybody else that you're including them is a strange form of inclusion. And I think we just need to move into a more vibrant, to recognize we're a mixed belief society. That's religious belief and non-religious belief. Let's talk about that, see how it can resource positive change, but not try and maintain institutions which give privilege to one and sort of cover it by saying, oh, we're Christian in some vague sense.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. I mean, I think once you get your national symbols, you know, whether they are flags or anthems or parliament or monarchy or whatever it's going to be, it should be ones that are unifying forces. They shouldn't be divisive and exclusive. I think that comes to the very heart of it for me as a liberal. Laurelie, can I come back to you in this?
Yeah. Well, only very briefly, because after the erudite comments that we've had, I've got much left to say. But I totally agree with Simon and what he said. And I suspect that we are the only party to have voted for disestablishment. And I suspect that this will be one of the most difficult aspects of reform ever to achieve, because politicians only get into Parliament if they are elected, and by declaring yourself as wanting to disestablish the Church of England, there will be a huge backlash, in my view, against that amongst some members, very notable and honourable exceptions throughout. But I do think that when you get to the low politics, you know, self-interest does rear its head, and that's why I think it's going to be around with us for a long period of time to come, unfortunately.
Okay, Toby, can we bring in the next round of questions?
Yes, I have two from Mohammed Amin and from Nasser Butt, if I can manage to find that one. From Mohammed, while I'm all for disestablishment, is it fair of Laurelie Burt to criticise the bishops and the lords for not getting involved in political issues? Would she want them involved in political issues? And Nasser's question, what governments are secular and have they achieved the kinds of benefits in practice that we could use to argue our case in England, the UK? Okay.
Actually, before I come to the panel, John Ball tells us that no policy for no practice of lapsing policy, so policy of 1999 remains good. I would say that's a recommendation for nice, short, crisp policy motions for future conferences. Right, the policies. Sorry, the question from Mohammed about Laurelie being unfair to bishops. Laurelie, you should be ashamed of yourself.
I'm not sure that's what Mohammed is saying, actually, and I think he's kind of got me banged to rights there, because I was criticising the fact that the bishops try to steer away from politics, and no, I absolutely wouldn't want them to suddenly gang up on any particular political party or policy. You know, I totally agree with what he's saying. I suppose what I'm saying is the fact that they're there at all means that they are faced with that dilemma, and really they shouldn't be there, and therefore, you know, they shouldn't have this problem to worry about.
Okay, I mean, before I'll come to Simon and Cordelia then, a question about secular countries throughout Europe, because that works in different ways in different places. Now, I mean, if you look in recent history in France, the wearing of face coverings for Muslim women, for example, has become a politically highly charged and quite exclusive issue because of the way in which the French see their own constitutional position as a secular nation. Yeah. So, you know, disestablishing your church is only one part of it. That's the negative, if you like. It's the positive that you put in the place after that and how you manage that that really makes the difference. Simon.
Yeah, I mean, to come in, it's a really important issue. It seems to me that, you know, obviously, secularism and secularity is a spectrum of possible positions, ranging from where I would be, which is what I would call plural secularism, that seeks to create a level playing field without privilege for everybody, that isn't about necessarily excluding religion from debates or whatever, but is about saying we shouldn't have privilege for particular groups, right through to the more eliminative approach of, you know, as you say, the particular conditions of France, which is, I mean, France is in real trouble in terms of its minority communities and lots of other things. And I think it's very, very difficult to try and promote a different, more liberal approach to things, particularly in the civic arena. And I think that's where you, as as, you know, I was going to say self-confessed liberals, as proud liberals, you know, the liberal tradition has something incredibly important to say in this, because it's possible and absolutely necessary to have a form of secularity which is liberal. And that's something that we need to get people of faith engaged with and see not as a threat, but as a necessity and an opportunity. It's actually about protecting people's freedoms rather than constraining them, but often is seen in a different way.
Simon, I'm going to have to cut out at this point because we've kind of reached the witching hour for me. So I'm going to hand the chair back to Toby, who will doubtless then take it to Cordelia. But before I go, listen, can I thank our visitors, in particular, Cordelia and Simon, for our tremendously interesting and stimulating conversation today. Toby for facilitating it. Laurelie for being Laurelie, and to everybody who has taken part in it. It's been a great chat. We'll maybe see you around the rest of the conference, and if not, we'll hopefully see you at some point in the autumn in real life, possibly even. Right, but I need to go, so thank you for that. See you later.
Good to meet you, Alistair. Thanks.
Thank you, Alistair. Farewell. Cordelia, your turn now, I think.
Hey, thanks, Toby. So I suppose I was kind of reflecting on the question around, and I completely agree with Simon's point around secularism being on this spectrum, and I think that a lot of what we see in kind of in theoretically or maybe formally secular countries, and then this actual kind of what when we really think about, or what a lot of us think about, is kind of towards this kind of pluralist secular democracy. There's a lot to be lacking from a lot of these formally secular countries. I mean, one of the examples, which I think is probably it may be easiest for people to think of, is in the US, where they kind of have this very formal separation of church and state, and in reality, quite in reality, the influence of religion in the States is enormous, absolutely enormous. The thought of having a non-religious or just a non-Christian president of the US, I mean, at least publicly, is pretty much unthinkable, not least when we think about the kind of the other wide implications. And so I think it's there is, while I think that, formal secularism, as I kind of call it, is a necessary element of going towards that goal, it is by far not sufficient. And I think both France and the US demonstrate how this kind of feeling like it's almost like a box ticking, like, yeah, of course we don't discriminate, in reality is very far from the truth. And I know that the question was directed towards Laurelie, but it was about the bishops. It can be, and especially myself as a lobbyist, the bishops on many of the issues that I campaign on are extremely helpful, in fact, because they agree with the things that you're asking for. So just earlier this week, there was a vote, and Laurelie, in the House of Lords, on the position of migrant survivors of domestic abuse, and ensuring that essentially they're not blocked from accessing life-saving refuge accommodation because they are not permitted to claim benefits, which is usually used to support a stay in refuge, right? So they're being trapped with their abusers for very long periods of time, and the bishops voted in favour of those amendments, and they passed. So I'm thinking, well, this is brilliant. However, on principle, the fact that the bishops are there is a problem, and I think there's another thing that I think come back to, is that you have these 26 individuals here, but we also have hundreds of other peers that also voted in favour of these amendments. So yeah, I wanted to kind of just come in on that, because it can be conflicting, and I've in other roles I've directly engaged with, called Bishop Rachel, and she's a lovely woman, and is holds very many positive views, but we can't forget that the church also managed to successfully lobby for exemptions from the Equality Act for themselves.
Yes.
So whenever you start to feel maybe slightly conflicted, I always remember they fundamentally do have a self-interest, and will exert that when when they can, when they feel the need to.
I think that's absolutely right. And I mean, I felt as a Christian, it was absolutely disgraceful the way Church of England bishops reacted on the equality thing. It's unfortunately fairly rare. You have to be a senior bishop to get into the House of Lords. Occasionally a more subversive one emerges. I mean, I'm sure he won't mind, he's well in retirement now, but Peter Selby, the former Bishop of Worcester, who campaigned on prisons, on poverty, on debt issues, very pro-LGBTQIA+ as well, he was one of those who spoke out against the bishops using their position to block equalities legislation. And he would sort of privately admit that basically he didn't think he should be there. And I used to say to him, well, while you are there, go on doing the good stuff you're doing. But as Cordelia has said, the system is not sustainable or right.
Right. I'm full of admiration for Julian Huppert, among others, who's actually capable of chairing a meeting and also fielding questions from the Q&A. I find it terrifying, so it's just as well we only have time for one or two more. One of them from Eleanor Hall. How much time do the 26 bishops spend in the Lords? Surely they have church duties to perform in their own diocese. I think perhaps the principle is more an interesting and important question than the practical. And from Muhammad Amin again, the King or Queen has to be an Anglican and cannot marry a Roman Catholic. Is it fair that he or she should be denied the freedom of religion that the rest of us all take for granted? And if you keep your responses short, you may be able to squeeze in concluding remarks as well. We have 7.5 minutes or so. Shall we start with Simon this time? You're on mute still, Simon.
Which is I was responding to something in the chat. So what was the question that you were?
Well, the questions were, how much time do the 26 bishops spend in the Lords? And the Queen has to be an Anglican and cannot marry a Catholic. Is that fair?
No, obviously it's outrageous. Again, I may burn bridges by saying that I'm also opposed to the monarchy, but that's another issue. I mean, actually, well, we have a member of the House here who will probably comment in a more informed way, but my general impression from monitoring is that bishops don't turn up a huge amount. I mean, there's usually a duty bishop who turns up on a particular day. There'll be particular issues that they pick up. They have a tendency to turn up in mass when there's something to be defended, often, in my view, in an unacceptable way. But you know, most of their duties are out with the House of Lords. And as I said earlier, when we tried to organise some very reasonable and considered and considerate lobbying of them to consider their position and perhaps to advocate some reform of a second chamber, I think over 3,000 people wrote to the 26 bishops in the House of Lords as of 2010. Only about half a dozen even got a reply. And as I said, I got a complaint about this. I mean, this is an extraordinary attitude of presumption, really. And that's not a comment on the individuals, because as Cordelia says, some of them are lovely people, but there's a sort of built-in arrogance to that kind of status. So anyway, sorry, I shouldn't rant on.
Right. Cordelia?
Hi, yes. I mean, in terms of the time, I think actually the past year with hybrid parliament, it's a lot easier because the House of Lords have retained this kind of element of hybrid parliament. It's a lot easier for bishops to participate, for bishops and all other peers to participate. And so the vote that I was talking about earlier on migrant women, I think it was 10 bishops voted in that, which is quite, I mean, that's quite substantial. In terms of the monarch, I mean, I think I really think it's outrageous, actually. And when you think about the kind of this huge, you know, pressure, and you think, you know, when you think about the individual, because it really is, it's about that individual. And, you know, don't get me wrong, you know, royals have an awful lot of privilege in many other ways, but this is, you know, freedom of religion or belief is not one of them. That's a really fundamental, supposedly inalienable human right that has been alienated from this, you know, this group of individuals, and it is just not at all compatible with what I think most individuals, when you think about human rights, think is just so basic. You know, you are not permitted to marry that individual on the basis of their and your religion. It feels, you know, a complete violation of this kind of really fundamental human right. So, I mean, essentially, the question was that fair? No. In my view, no, not at all. So, yes.
It also models something terrible
Right.
for the nation, that should be the case. Given are meant to be symbolic, unifying figures, etc. Incredible.
I think this question does indicate that disestablishment does go considerably beyond the question of whether there should be bishops reserved places in the Lords, by the way. Laurelie, I'm going to work on the assumption that we will not get cut off at 15:15 promptly. And if you answer your question, then we can go to concluding remarks and hope to get through all three of you with any luck.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I totally agree that this whole must marry a Church of England person for the monarch is ridiculous. And like Simon, you know, yes, I don't think that our royal family should exist in the way that it does at all, if at all. In terms of the amount of time that the bishops spend, I think they do have a rota. They rock up when it's something that's important to them. And I don't think it's really run. I must ask Bishop Rachel when I next speak to her, you know, but I don't think that, you know, they work in the same way as necessarily other political parties, although they would agree their approach to specific areas. Yeah, so very often you'll just get one or two when it's a more important thing. You know, in the olden days before we had remote voting, which has been a wonderful boon, you would see them all rocking up on the benches in the same way that other parties would. How they manage to combine all of that with their churchly duties, I really don't know. But there you go. That's another reason why they should be sticking to their job and not interfering with ours, in my esteemed opinion.
Thank you, Laurelie. I'm going to make my concluding remarks, which are very, very brief now, just because of the risk that we'll get cut off. I'm delighted that we've had something in the region of 90 people participating in this event today, and we haven't had to throw a single person out of the room, which is a huge advantage over the physical events at the conference. So thank you all for coming, and thank you also to our speakers. And I'm going to start with concluding remarks with Simon, and then go to Laurelie and finish with Cordelia.
Okay, thanks a lot. I've really enjoyed being part of it. Thank you very much for inviting me. Really appreciate this, and these kinds of conversations are important, and I'm glad I haven't been kicked out either. That's great. I think the thing I want to say at the end is two brief things. I mean, one is, again, just to come back to the fact we've talked a lot about the House of Lords and so on. That's brave comments from Laurelie. I really appreciate those. But again, to emphasise, that isn't disestablishment. It's actually possible both to disestablish, that is, to break the link between the Crown and the state in law, the Crown and the Church in law, and still have bishops in the House of Lords, still have unreformed faith schools, etc., and vice versa. So there's part of a pattern here, which I think Alistair drew attention to earlier. And finally, someone asked, I noticed in the chat very fairly, well, perhaps we should have had a bishop along, you know, to balance it out and so on. It's terrible to say this, but I mean, you know, I know quite a few bishops, and I like some of them. I can tell you exactly what they'd say. They'd say, oh, it's not about privilege, it's about service, you know, etc., etc., etc. So I've been there over a long thing. But as I say, the focus of our conversation was actually disestablishment. And that's a small part. Maybe we haven't said a lot. I will try and expand on that a bit more in an article that I'm going to publish on Ekklesia probably around about 4 o'clock this afternoon, which will build on what I said earlier, if you're interested in that particular mechanism.
I certainly am, and I hope I can follow up on that with you, Simon, afterwards.
Well, I've learned a huge amount this afternoon. put my my prejudices up front and centre, and I've noticed in the chat a lot of very constructive remarks and criticisms as well, and I totally accept and I will try and learn from those. But I've learned so much from Simon and Cordelia as well, about the technical aspects of it, particularly. And yes, I'll be having a look, Simon, to see what you put this afternoon as well. I'm just very grateful to have been here, and hope I've been some use anyway in just being able to paint a picture of what it's like to work in the upper chamber with the bishops.
Thank you very much, Laurelie. And finally, I'm very proud to present Cordelia with the short straw of the final contribution. And I hope you'll be able to make
I'll be very quick. And I think, you know, what we've learned, and actually absolutely agree with Simon, is that formal establishment is actually quite a narrow part of what we're looking at related to actually Parliament's power over internal church governments and governance, and you know, things around the monarchy, the sovereign having to be, you know, kind of the faith, etc. But I think what is very clear is that establishment and this privileged position of the church has an extremely extensive impact, both in the kind of the formal power of the church, but also through the softer power when they're engaging with ministers and others. And fundamentally, this is incompatible with a pluralist democracy. And while disestablishment is a necessary component of moving towards that pluralistic democracy which we so crave, it absolutely is not sufficient. As Simon touched on, you know, faith schools and many other kind of examples of religious privilege would still exist with formal disestablishment, but it's absolutely something that is the necessary part of moving towards a fully equal society. And that's it. I'm also very interested in your article, Simon.
Right, thank you, Cordelia. Thank you all. If you don't have to rush off like Alistair, you're very welcome to carry on talking among yourselves to an audience which is still 63 people, happily. And perhaps I can bang in a question where, if we want to proceed with disestablishment in all its forms, how do we go about it technically? Never mind persuading parliamentarians and indeed the general public. How practically can it be done?
I'm going to have to go. Sorry, just to interrupt, Toby. I have to go just because my computer, I've seen the little the little icon on the battery is saying that it's about to go. But it's been a real pleasure. And yeah, I'm sure that you'll continue having a very constructive debate. But thank you very much for inviting me, and it was really lovely to participate. But take care, everybody.
Great to meet you, Cordelia. Have been in touch.
Thank you very much.
The answer to that is I will try and see if I can dig out Ian McLean's bill that would have been the enabling legislation for disestablishment. As I said very briefly in my opening remarks, the difficulty is not so much the mechanism of disestablishment. The difficulty is that you then have questions as to what you do about, you know, property and investment relationships between the Crown and the Church, what belongs to who, if you're going to separate them, etc., etc. That's where it starts to get tricky. I'm married to a constitutional lawyer, so I know something about that. But it's not, as I said, the actual affecting disestablishment is a straightforward thing. It's how it affects everything else that really is the issue. And I think, as Alistair and probably Laurelie has said earlier, you know, it's part of a wider set of reforms that one needs to look at, including to the second chamber and so on, because although establishment is a technical mechanism within that, it's part of a wider settlement.
Do you have any comments, Laurelie? I should say there's a little clock at the top of my screen saying time left 1 day, 6 hours and 10 minutes, but I don't think we can rely on that.
No, I've got nothing else to add, Toby. I don't do technical, as you might have gathered. Just delighted to be able to learn so much in this session. And with that, I need to jump off the call as well now.
Yep.
So just to say thank you so much to everyone for listening as well, and thanks to Toby for doing all the organisational stuff. We were trying to get me into the room at about 10 o'clock this morning, but we managed in the end.
Very, very nice to meet you as well.
I'm
sure we might be in touch about some things as well. Okay.
I'll still cross again.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye all.
Bye. Thank you very much, everybody. I'm now closing
Excellent.
down
Be in
this
touch.
session. I
Thanks
hope
to
you enjoyed
everybody.
it.
Really, really
Thank you.
appreciated people's comments and engagement. Take care then.
Bye.